This is Mr. Simonton, welcoming you to a rather exhilarating start to a special edition of Mr. Simonton's This Week in History, commemorating the 82nd anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. This message, air raid on Pearl Harbor, this is no drill, was commanded to be sent out by Commander Logan C. Ramsey. He saw an airplane flying low over Ford Island, where he was at. Didn't see the bomb that was dropped and all this. He wasn't going to get the plane's ID number so he could report the pilot. And the next thing you know, the bomb explodes. He goes, holy crap, it's the Japanese. Runs into the office there, tells the radio operator to send out this signal, air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. And the radio operator says, do you want me to send it in code? And he says, hell no, send it out in the clear. And that's how that became a very famous message. The architects of Pearl Harbor, the primary architect in the center here is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. And kind of an interesting thing, he proposed the plan the same day to the Japanese High Command that somebody in Department of Naval Affairs said that, hey, maybe Pearl Harbor might be attacked by the Japanese. And he was dismissed, but they definitely, the Japanese High Command thought very highly of Yamamoto's plan. Now, the primary architect of this, the planning of the logistics, was on the right-hand side here, Commander Minoru Genda. And he was a genius tactician. He said, okay, we attack with 6 carriers. We use about 350 aircraft. We modify bombs and torpedoes. We sail a northerly route because we won't run into commercial shipping because usually the sea is terrible in the month of December in the northern Pacific. We attack on a Sunday when most of the ships will be in harbor. Also on the weekends, since most of the sailors will be on shore, most of the aircraft will be down on the ground instead of doing patrols. So genius. He basically thought of everything. The leader of the fleet is over there on the left-hand side, Admiral Shuichi Nagumo. He was the commander of the Pearl Harbor Task Force, and regrettably for the Japanese, he should have followed up with the third wave, but he was kind of concerned that since they didn't find the American aircraft carriers, that his force might be attacked, and he thought his main goal, besides destroying the American fleet, was to get the fleet back to Japan, so that's why he didn't launch a third wave. Failures of the U.S. defense. There was a great many Japanese population on the island of Oahu, so the military establishment thought that sabotage was a greater concern than a naval attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor because it was just so remote and we would probably see them coming. Well, that's not what happened. So what they did was they lined up all the airplanes in a row, so when the Japanese did attack Pearl Harbor, they were just easy pickings for the Japanese fighter to strafe and destroy and damage many, many aircraft. A second failure of the American defenses was there were no anti-torpedo nets deployed into the harbor. And the purpose of an anti-torpedo net is to catch and detonate any torpedoes that might be launched into ships. Of course, the problem with that is every time you need to move a ship either in or out of its docking space, you need to deal with these nets. You got to move them in and out of the way. And they thought, the United States Navy thought it was just not worth it because the depth of the harbor is only averages 40 feet. And American experience, Japanese experience, British experience, all that were using torpedo planes, realized that any time you dropped a standard torpedo, it would sink to about 120 to 150 feet. So the naval forces there in Pearl Harbor said, there's no possible way you wouldn't be able to use a torpedo in here. Well, the Japanese found a way. And the Americans finally learned from their mistakes. You see, this is in 1944. This is the latest American battleship, the USS Wisconsin. And you notice, what's outside of it? Anti-torpedo nets. And what you see inboard of it alongside the dock is the USS Oklahoma, one of the only 2 ships that was never put back into service after the attack. Torpedoes, speaking of those torpedoes, a couple of things that the Japanese did to modify them is they put wooden fins on the back here to help stabilize it as it was flying through the air before it struck the water. But the genius part was actually these fins here. They were hooked up to a gyroscope which would keep the torpedo level so that it wouldn't sink, wouldn't go nose down when it hit the water, but actually would get it to stay very parallel in the water and so it wouldn't sink very deep. And they could use it in that 40-foot deep harbor, and it was extremely successful. And you can see 425 pounds of high explosives. Another genius move by the Japanese. I want to take a look at the 800-kilogram bomb here. It's about 1,800 pounds. Now, they did not have an armor-piercing bomb in their naval aviation stores. So the genius of the Japanese was to take a naval artillery shell, which was from their battleship class, the Nagatos, which had 16-inch guns. They took the shell from the 16-inch guns and put a modified covering or a casing over it to make it aerodynamic. And that's what they used actually to punch through the American armor in our battleships. They could punch through 6 inches of solid steel armor. It only had 50 pounds of explosives, as you see here, but that's enough to set off a magazine. Warning signs 1. Oh, it's like a bad Hollywood movie where you see the hero is going to go into a darkened room and you know there's somebody, the slasher is there. He says, don't go in there, don't go in there. And they go anyway, so they ignore those warnings. So here's the first warning. The trawler Condor reports a submarine about 3:50 a.m., so about 4 hours before the attack begins. At 3 hours later, the destroyer USS Ward and a PBY patrol plane find that submarine and they wind up sinking it. Actually, the gun crew, number 3 here of the USS Ward, are credited with sinking it. And as they said, they put a hole right through the base of the conning tower and it sank. Unfortunately, even though the base was notified, no action was taken. The officer there on duty said, well, I'm not going to sound the alarm unless I can actually get an actual confirmation that the sub was sunk. An interesting thing about that submarine, though, back in 2002, the University of Hawaii did find that submarine, and they took photographs of it. And sure enough, just like the gun crew number 3 on the USS Ward said, there was a 4-inch hole right in the side of the conning tower, right where they said it was. So they get credit for firing the first shots of the war and destroying the first Japanese vessel of the war as well. Now here was probably our best chance to at least prepare ourselves for the attack. So they had radar systems all around Oahu. And one of these radar systems in the northern part of Oahu detected the attack planes 135 miles away 5 minutes before the Ward sunk that Japanese submarine. And they lost contact because of the terrain of the island within 20 miles. Now here's the crazy part about this. The warning was ignored because the officers knew that there was a flight of 12 B-17s, that's an example here, coming in from the mainland. So they thought what they saw on the radar, or what they believed the report was just those B-17s, even though the direction was completely wrong. The force was coming in from the north, where the B-17s were actually coming from the east-northeast. So the direction was completely wrong. But you know what? You see what you want to see or what you expect to see, and they got it completely wrong, unfortunately. Here's the plan of the attack. As I mentioned, there were supposed to be 3 waves, but only 2 were conducted. The different colors represent the different types of aircraft. The orange is the high-level bombers. The light blue are dive bombers. The blue is torpedo bombers, and the white are the fighters. You notice that the fighters, their main job is to take out the airfields at Wheeler Field, Kenaoe, Bellows, Hickam, and Ewa. Dive bombers, you had 26 coming on the first wave, but you notice almost 80 of them are coming on the second wave. To me, something that was kind of interesting was the torpedo bombers were only coming into the first wave, and there were 40 of them. And there were 50 high-level bombers versus 36 in the 2 respective waves. This is the last moment of peace. This is basically when the Japanese arrived over Pearl Harbor. This is what they saw, and mainly want to examine here Battleship Row. Now, one of the battleships, USS Pennsylvania, was in dry dock. But here on the southern part of Pearl Harbor was the U.S. battleship USS California. Just slightly above it is going to be the USS Maryland in board of the USS Oklahoma, the USS Tennessee in board of the USS West Virginia, the USS Arizona in board of the repair ship Vestal, and then at the aft end of the line, of the battle line there, is the USS Nevada.
This is not a drill. This is not a drill. General quarters. All hands at your battle station.
Okay, here's a photograph taken by a Japanese aircraft, and it's actually kind of fascinating from an historical standpoint. This is about 5 to 10 minutes into the attack. We notice that the USS Nevada here does not seem to have suffered any damage. Neither has the Vestal or the USS Arizona. However, the USS West Virginia has at least suffered 2 to 3 torpedo strikes. You can see the oil leaking out from here, and there's a plume of water right here by the aft conning tower. It's about 130 feet in height, and there's another picture actually taken from the other side of the island by another Japanese aircraft that shows that this plume is going to rise to about 500 feet. Here's the USS Oklahoma in board of the USS Maryland. It's already been hit by a couple of torpedoes. Once I mentioned, the USS West Virginia is starting to list to port, You can see that the USS Oklahoma is just starting its list, but it's going to get more dramatic as the time goes on. And over here on the far right is the USS California, already being hit by a couple of torpedoes. You see the oil slick. And already in this image, you can tell it's already going down by the bow. Other interesting things that we can see in this image, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 torpedo splashes. It looks like there's a bomb splash here that are already in the water. And we know at least 3 of them have already struck home, and definitely one here at the California. And you'll also notice from both the California and the Oklahoma, there are shock waves in the water from the West Virginia and also radiating out from the USS Oklahoma. Speaking of the USS Oklahoma, one of the only 2 ships that is never raised, they're struck by 9 torpedoes in rather rapid succession, and it capsizes, which means it rolls over and sinks in 12 minutes. Regrettably, 425 crewmen are lost, and as I mentioned, even though the ship was raised, it was never put back into service. And you can see here was its location outboard, so completely open torpedo to attack. So here's the upturned hull of the Oklahoma. Here is the twin towers of the USS California, and then to the starboard side of the Oklahoma is the USS Maryland, which didn't suffer very much damage. And here's the USS Oklahoma capsize sequence. So here's the water level, and the brown represents the bottom of the harbor. And it's hit by 3 torpedoes very, very quickly, followed by another 5, and it could have settled in the bottom, even with this 5th one. If they had counter-flooded the starboard side of the ship, it could have settled upright. But it just happened so quickly they didn't even have a chance to open up the drains and open up and flood those tanks. But it's the 9th one that really pushed it over. And this 9th torpedo pushed this wedge of water that was sitting here. It pushed the ship's bottom part of the hull. It just basically acted like a wedge, turned the ship over, and rolled it into the mud. Regrettably, 429 sailors were killed in this. Probably the saddest event of the day is this ship here, the USS Arizona. Okay, it was struck by 4 bombs. The first 3 did very limited damage, but the 4th bomb detonates 528 tons. That's over 1 million pounds of high explosives in the forward magazine. And what you're seeing here is a movie taken by Captain Hawkinson of the United States Army. He was in the Army Medical Corps, and he was on the hospital ship Solace. And so you can see this is his perspective. He was looking south towards the Arizona when the ship blew up. Now here's an illustration of the blast progression. So here's where the bomb hit. Here's turret 2, here's turret 1. It fell, you can see just aside turret 2. Went right through the magazine, set those off, plunged into the harbor. So here's the interesting thing. There's a 13-inch bulkhead at the front of the powder magazine, but it's only 3.5 inches above it and another 2 inches here. So as you see, as it begins, the explosion begins, it's moving towards the upper bulkhead and the forward bulkhead. Now it's hit that 13-inch bulkhead. That puts up a lot of resistance. The weaker resistance, of course, is the 3.5-inch bulkhead, so it starts rising up through there. Also notice on the left-hand side, all the starboard magazine room is filled up with hot exploding gases, so it moves over to the port side. And once it moves into the port side and ignites the port side magazine room, the whole thing lets go. And here's the explosion again in a much larger image. What is kind of hard to tell here, and I just recently learned of this, the forward mast of the Arizona was pushed 30 feet into the air from where it was located. And also the blast was so powerful that it sent a 10-foot high wave of water crashing onto Ford Island just to the starboard side of the ship. You can see a pretty massive explosion. Now you notice a lot of smoke seems to be coming out of the smokestack, and a lot of people thought that the bomb went right down the smokestack. But that's not what happened. Smokestacks are designed to remove smoke from the boilers. So it was just an easy place for the gases to exhaust themselves out of the ship because it was already designed to remove gases from the ship itself. As I mentioned, it was the USS Arizona is probably the saddest case here. 1,177 men were lost, including 21 sets of brothers were killed, as well as a father-son pair. But the sadness doesn't stop there. There were an additional 11 sets of brothers, And of those other 11 sets, there was only one survivor per family, so very devastating to families. Also among the losses were Rear Admiral Isaac C. Kidd and Captain Franklin von Falkenberg. Neither of them was ever found, none of their remains were found. However, they did find Admiral Kidd's Naval Academy ring melted into the deck on the bridge of the Arizona, but that's all they were able to locate of him. And here's the Arizona after its destruction. Here's the wreck of the Arizona. So this was drawings done by Navy divers as they looked at it. This turret is no longer here. It's been removed and the metal's been scrapped, but the rest of the ship is still here, and you can visit that today. This is kind of something rather interesting. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, he was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, and as he was staring out of the headquarters windows at the destruction of his fleet, a bullet came right through the window and struck him right in the chest and fell at his feet. Well, the officer standing next to him picks up the bullet, and he looks at it and he shows it to Kimmel, and the bullet was bent, so it was apparently a ricochet. And upon seeing that, looking at the bullet and then looking out across the harbor at the destruction of his fleet, he uttered these words: "It would have been merciful if it had killed me." And it didn't, and he was actually discharged from his command of the Pacific Fleet. Cordell Hull. Yeah, so he was meeting with the Japanese ambassador. Now, Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State at the time, and the Japanese were supposed to give the United States an ultimatum at least 1 hour before the attack took place. But regrettably, the Japanese embassy didn't have an excellent typist, so it took them a long time to decode the message. So the message wasn't delivered through the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, till about an hour and a half after the attack happened. Now, Cordell Hull knew the attack was taking place, but Ambassador Nomura and his special envoy, Kurusu, did not know. So the Japanese government kept them completely in the dark. And so here's a picture of them about a month before the attack took place. And the next thing you're going to see is a clip from the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. And it's a beautiful scene about how Cordell Hull reacts to reading this letter, this ultimatum, when he knows the attack has already happened.
In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document so crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions, on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them.
Now, I wish this scene would have continued in the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. Ambassador Nomura tries to plead with Cordell Hull, and he says, "Mr. Hull." And Hull doesn't look at him. He simply closes his eyes, puts his head down, and says one word: "Go." And so Nomura and Kurusu get up, open the door, begins to walk out, and Nomura's got his hand on the door, and he takes one last look at Hull, and Hull still has his head down with his eyes closed, and Nomura exits and closes the door. It's a great scene and wonderfully acted. I wish the rest of the clip would have been there. Now, the very next day, December 8th, we have a speech from President Roosevelt to both houses of the Congress of the United States.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
I kind of love his intonation there when he pauses and he says, a state of war, making sure that those words were very measured when he delivered them. The losses, both sides. Personnel killed, 1,998. You'll notice there's a footnote here. 1,177 of them, almost 1,200 of the deaths, come from the USS Arizona alone. Japan suffered only 134 losses, and of those, nearly 80 of them were due to the 5 midget submarines that didn't make it, and then one fleet submarine, the I-70, which lost 70 crewmen. None of them were really involved in the battle at all. Wounded, we don't know about the Japanese wounded personnel, American personnel. We do have that. Ships sunk or beached. The United States had 12 of them sunk, but apart from 2 of them, the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma, all the other ships were repaired and put back into service. The Japanese, they only lost 6, and they were all the submarines, the fleet submarine and the 5 midget submarines. Destroyed aircraft, the Japanese only lost 29. You can see the Americans lost 164, primarily due to those practice of parking them all in a row, and damaged almost 160, so almost equal amounts damaged and destroyed, whereas the Japanese only had 74 destroyed. Failures of the Japanese attack. So as bad as this was, it didn't turn out to be as bad. If the third attack had happened, it really would have turned out really bad for the United States. The biggest thing that helped us, none of our aircraft carriers were in the harbor at the time. All 3 American aircraft carriers that were stationed out in the Pacific were not near or at Pearl Harbor. The USS Saratoga was in San Diego finishing up its refit. The USS Lexington, its sister ship, was actually headed towards Midway, so it was 300 miles away from wherever this was going on. And the closest ship to the action was the USS Enterprise. It was about 200 miles away from Oahu when the attack happened. It actually knew that the attack was happening because the radio signals, and they sent out patrol planes to go look for the Japanese fleet, but they never found them. So they came in the day after, refueled, resupplied, and went out looking for the Japanese because they didn't want to get caught in the harbor. Another thing that the Japanese failed to do, and this is primarily due to the failure of not having a third attack, they didn't go after the tank farms, which had all this aviation fuel and bunker C fuel, which is what basically powered the ships. You can have a completely intact ship, but if you've got no fuel to run it, it's not going anywhere, and they failed to destroy the tank farms. Another thing that they failed to do, because they just didn't think they were important, they wanted to go after battleships and carriers, were the American submarines. Turns out the American submarines wound up sinking more Japanese tonnage than any other force in the Pacific, whether it was battleships or aircraft, all up to the American submarine force. And they didn't attack the submarine base either. Another thing they failed to go after, which was supposed to happen in the third attack, was repair facilities. Their dry docks and other repair facilities. So even the ships that were damaged, they would have had to have been towed all the way back to San Diego or San Francisco to repair, nearly 2,500 miles away. But since the repair facilities weren't damaged, they were able to just pull them a couple of 100 yards, put them in the dry docks and repair them and send them back out to the fleet. So that was another failure. But probably the biggest failure of the Japanese was believing that the Americans would simply lay down and go away and lick their wounds. But instead, because it was a sneak attack, if we had known the attack was coming, we might have been able to stomach it better, but we don't go in for sneak attacks, and because we felt that the Japanese did that to us, we were filled with a passion for vengeance, and regrettably, it took us all the way to August 6th and August 9th with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the Japanese kind of paid for that, unfortunately, in the end, many civilians as well. Now, this quote has been attributed to a couple of people. I couldn't actually find that Yamamoto actually said this, but in the final line of the movie Tora, 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 they credited him with this. Like I said, I couldn't find any evidence that it was actually true, but because the movie said it, I'm going to go ahead and use it anyways. But I do love the quote. I fear that all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. And regrettably for Yamamoto, his aircraft was going to be shot down over an island, the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, in April of 1943, and he would be killed. And so many people thought, hey, we finally got vengeance on the architect of Pearl Harbor. Now, if you want to get more into this, for one thing, if you can email me, I've got a slide presentation that's virtually twice as long as what you're seeing here. So even though this is very long, this one's even longer. If you're looking for books that would you like to read, the book, even 50 years later, is still considered this book here, At Dawn We Slept by Gordon Prang. Probably one of the most heavily researched books on Pearl Harbor. And because it's heavily researched, I got to warn you, it's about 850 pages in length. And I've read it from cover to cover, and it is a brilliant work of expository literature. If you don't want to wade through 850 pages, then I can highly recommend this other book, which I also have, Pearl Harbor 1941. And this is published by Osprey Military Publisher, Classic Battles. This is only about 60 pages in it, and the nice thing about it, it's got a lot of pictures and diagrams and everything else about the planes, the attack patterns, what happened in Battleship Row and the different ships. So I highly recommend that one. If you're still not into reading, then I highly recommend this movie, Tora, 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 which is Japanese for Tiger, 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 which was the code word to be sent out that they achieved surprise attack. Now, when this movie came out in the 70s, it wasn't a big hit at the box office. And there's been another movie called Pearl Harbor itself, which is just a travesty of historical accuracy. Please, please, please do not watch this. Now, admittedly, this movie, for you younger folks, might be a little bit kind of on the boring side. It's more historical than it is action-oriented. But if you want to really find out what happened, which is fairly accurate, in fact, this History Channel said it was about 85% accurate versus Hollywood, this would be the movie to watch. And something unique about this movie is that when they were writing this, the producers, which was 20th Century Fox, they went to Japanese producers and directors and say, hey, we want you to tell your story about Pearl Harbor, and we'll tell the American story about Pearl Harbor, and then in the editing room, we will put both of these together. So it's a very even-handed depiction of what happened on both sides. So it's very fair to both sides, and it's very rare that you see in films that actually happens. It's either pro one side or pro the other. This is very even-handed in its depiction of both the Japanese version of events and the American version of events. And with that, I'm going to leave you with this final tribute to the USS Arizona.